The year 1398 marked a brutal chapter in history that would leave an indelible scar on the world and forever link the name of Timur, also known as Tamerlane, with terror. His rise to power was not based on diplomacy or alliances, but on the destruction of his enemies and the fear he instilled across vast territories. Timur's empire, stretching across Central Asia, Afghanistan, and northern India, was forged through relentless conquest. His military campaigns were not simply aimed at gaining territory, they were focused on breaking the will of any who dared oppose him. The path he carved was one of devastation, and when he reached Delhi, the capital of the Delhi Sultanate, it would be no different. Delhi was a wealthy and culturally vibrant city, and its ruler, Sultan Nasiruddin Mahmud Shah Tughlaq, assembled a vast army to protect it from Timur's approaching forces. The Delhi Sultanate's army was formidable, comprising thousands of soldiers, including elite warriors mounted on armored elephants, which were considered one of the most powerful military assets of the time. However, Timur, a military genius, had a different kind of warfare in mind, one that would neutralize the power of the elephants and reduce the strength of the Delhi army. Timur's forces were clever in their approach. He had camels loaded with straw, which were set alight before being sent charging into the midst of the Delhi army. As the camels raced through the ranks, the chaos among the elephants was immediate. The animals, panic-stricken by the fire, turned wild and trampled over their own men, causing disarray in the ranks. The Delhi forces, already thrown into confusion by this unexpected attack, quickly lost their grip on the battle. The well-organized defense of Delhi disintegrated in the face of Timur's strategic ingenuity. It was not a battle of brute force alone. It was a battle of psychological warfare, and Timur had one. After the fall of the city, Timur's army surged into Delhi, looting and pillaging the streets while the city's defenders were left broken. But the horrors of the battle were nothing compared to the massacre that followed. Timur, upon seizing the city, ordered the capture of over 100,000 prisoners, most of whom were Hindus. These prisoners were seen as a potential threat to his newly claimed territory. And Timur, ever the strategist, decided that they had to be eliminated. The reasoning behind this decision was clear: to prevent any uprisings or future rebellions. His brutal calculation was that the destruction of the city's populace would serve as a reminder to anyone who might consider defying him. Timur's orders were chilling in their scope. All 100,000 prisoners were to be executed in a single day. This was not a swift massacre, but a slow and methodical execution that took place throughout the night. Executioners worked tirelessly, cutting down men, women, and children alike, sparing none. There were no exceptions for the weak, the elderly, or the helpless. Everyone met the same fate. Timur's forces showed no mercy, for to show mercy would be a sign of weakness in his eyes. The massacre was conducted with ruthless precision. Bodies began to pile up in the streets of Delhi. The bloodshed was so overwhelming that the streets became unrecognizable, covered in the blood of those who had been slaughtered. This massacre was not about just killing enemies. It was about sending a message. It was psychological warfare taken to its extreme. Timur wanted to ensure that the people of Delhi and any other city that might consider rebellion would know that resistance meant annihilation. He wanted to instill fear, and through these brutal executions, he achieved just that. The sheer scale of death made it impossible for any other region to ignore the consequences of defying his rule. His empire, built on terror, would not tolerate dissent. Even the survivors of the massacre understood the lesson that Timur wanted to teach. Defy him, you will be wiped from existence. But what is most chilling about Timur's actions is that this massacre was not isolated. It was part of a broader strategy that Timur used across his entire empire to instill fear and crush resistance. This was not just a one-time act of violence. It was part of a calculated method to secure his rule through terror. He had proven that resistance would be met with annihilation, that those who challenged him would pay the ultimate price. His reputation as a brutal conqueror was cemented by such acts of mass execution, and word spread quickly throughout the region about the terrifying consequences of standing against Timur. For Timur, conquest was not merely about expanding territory, it was about control. The massacre of 100,000 prisoners in Delhi was not only a way to eliminate potential threats, it was a way to demonstrate his unyielding power. In the years that followed, other cities and regions would face the same brutal fate if they dared to challenge his rule. Timur's legacy was one of fear. His name became synonymous with terror. His campaigns left a trail of broken cities and shattered lives, and the memory of the bloodshed in Delhi would linger in the minds of those who heard of it for centuries to come. Timur's brutal tactics continued long after his victory in Delhi, marking his name in history as one of the most feared conquerors to ever exist. His reign was not merely about territorial expansion, it was about terrorizing entire populations into submission. The massacre in Delhi, though horrifying, was only the beginning of a series of atrocities that would define his conquests. His reputation for ruthless revenge spread rapidly, instilling fear wherever his name was spoken. But perhaps one of the most chilling acts of his reign came after the city of Isfahan rebelled against him in 1387. Isfahan, once a thriving and culturally significant city in Persia, had initially surrendered without resistance to Timur's forces. The citizens hoped that submission would spare them the horrors of war. But when a few local residents killed a group of Timur's soldiers, the conqueror's wrath was unleashed in full force. The attack on his soldiers was seen as a direct challenge to his authority, and for Timur, such defiance could not go unpunished. What followed was one of the most grotesque acts of retribution the world had ever witnessed. Timur ordered the massacre of the citizens of Isfahan, and the numbers were staggering. Contemporary accounts by historians like Sharaf ad-Din al-Yazdi and Ibn Khaldun suggest that as many as 70,000 to 200,000 people were killed. These executions were not quick nor chaotic. They were carried out with military precision. But the sheer scale of the bloodshed was not what made this event so infamous. What followed the killings was what truly struck terror into the hearts of those who heard of it. Timur had the skulls of the dead gathered and used to build towering pyramids. These skull pyramids were no ordinary piles of bones. They were meticulously constructed, with each tower made from hundreds or even thousands of skulls. The skulls were stacked by rank, so that soldiers were at the bottom, civilians in the middle, and religious leaders at the top. This gruesome sight served as a permanent reminder of what would happen to anyone who dared oppose Timur's rule. The pyramids were not just a physical display of victory, but a chilling symbol of fear and control. Eyewitnesses who visited the region years later spoke of these towers still standing as horrifying monuments to Timur's wrath. What is even more disturbing is that these skull pyramids were not built haphazardly, but were part of a broader, psychological strategy employed by Timur. His goal was not only to defeat his enemies in battle, but to break their spirits completely. The message was clear. If you resist, you will not only die, but be made into an object of terror. Your very remains will be used to remind others of the consequences of defiance. Timur's victories were not simply about military strength. They were about making an example of those who dared to challenge his might. But Isfahan was not the only city to feel Timur's brutal vengeance. In 1400, during his siege of Sivas, a fortified city in Anatolia, Timur employed a similar strategy of deception and betrayal. The defenders of Sivas, believing that surrender would spare their lives, agreed to Timur's terms. They surrendered on the condition that no blood would be spilled. Timur, known for his cunning and cruelty, gave his word that their blood would be spared. But he twisted this promise in the most horrific way imaginable. Instead of killing the defenders by sword or axe, he ordered that 3,000 of the soldiers be buried alive. The soldiers, trusting Timur's word, were thrown into deep trenches, and the earth was piled on top of them while they were still alive. The survivors suffocated beneath the weight of the soil, their screams unheard as they died in the darkness. Timur had promised that no blood would be spilled, but in his mind, burying the soldiers alive was an acceptable way to honor his word. This act of cruelty was calculated to strike fear into the hearts of other cities. It was a reminder that even submission would not guarantee mercy. In the eyes of Timur, mercy was a concept meant to be twisted, and no act of surrender was safe from his wrath. The horror of Sivas sent shockwaves throughout Anatolia, and other cities that might have considered resistance quickly reconsidered. The betrayal of the defenders by burial alive was a message that defiance would lead to annihilation, but submission would bring no real safety. Timur's tactics of psychological warfare were as effective as his military strategies. Cities fell not just due to the strength of his army, but due to the deep fear that his actions instilled in the minds of the people. His campaigns were not just wars. They were demonstrations of absolute power that left no room for rebellion. Timur's reign was characterized by brutal methods of control, but the psychological warfare he employed was as devastating as the physical destruction. His tactics extended beyond the battlefield as he used fear and terror to shape the future of the regions he conquered. Every city that fell before him became a symbol of the cost of defiance. Whether through the creation of skull pyramids or the burial of soldiers alive, Timur ensured that his name would be remembered not only for his military genius, but for the sheer terror he inspired. The legacy of Timur is a complex one. On one hand, he was a brilliant strategist and a conqueror who expanded his empire across vast regions. On the other hand, his methods left a trail of destruction that has haunted history for centuries. His reputation as a ruthless leader is cemented by the stories of massacres, betrayals, and terror that followed him wherever he went. Cities were not just conquered. They were obliterated, their people left broken, and their spirits crushed. Even today, the name Timur evokes images of fear and brutality, and the stories of his campaigns serve as a grim reminder of the cost of power when it is wielded without mercy. The skull pyramids of Isfahan, the mass executions in Delhi, and the betrayal of the soldiers at Sivas are not just historical events. They are the legacy of a man who reshaped the world through sheer terror. Where his empire did not just dominate the land, it dominated the minds of those who lived through it, and even those who came after. His reign of fear may have eventually crumbled, but the memory of his brutality remains etched in history.